Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be doing my November reading wrap up. In the month of November, I read 28 books. So I have a lot to talk about with regard to the books that I liked this month, the books that I didn't like this month, and what I accomplished in the month of November in my reading world. But first of all, if you are new here, I normally post book reviews almost every single day on my channel. So if you're looking to follow book reviews or get some reading inspiration on a wide variety of topics, then feel free to stick around. Now we have a lot of books to talk about, so let's go right into my November reading wrap up. So the numbers, 28 books were read in the month of November, and I also DNF'd one book. So that's 29 books that I'm going to be kind of referencing in total. Of those 28 books though, 3 books that I count towards my total for the month were books that I classify as personal. So I don't talk about books that are maybe related to my professional development, personal development, books about vacations I'm going, books that I just feel like wouldn't be very interesting to talk about or review on this channel. So I just cut those or take those right off the top. This leaves me with 25 books that I did finish in the month of November. I read 14 fiction books and 11 nonfiction books, so that's 56% fiction, 44% nonfiction, which my split does tend to be close to 50-50, 50% fiction, 50% nonfiction, so I'm right close to where I expect to be for this month. 28 books, though, is a lot for one month. For me, I would say I'm probably somewhere around 20 or maybe a little less. However, here in the United States, we did have a holiday this month and I had some time off work where I was able to accomplish some reading. So I think that time off really fed into my ability to get a lot of reading done, leading to these 28 books, which is a very high number. If I read 28 books every single month of the year, I would be well into the 300s. So 300 books read per year. So I'm not hitting that at all. And this is an abnormally high number to be reading in one month. I'm first going to go through and talk about all the books that I read, just give a brief high-level summary, and then I'm going to talk about ones I liked, ones I didn't like, as well as discussing the DNF that I had this month. So I'm going to first talk about fiction and then I'm going to talk about nonfiction. So if you're only interested in one or the other category, you can just skip ahead to where I talk about the category that fits you. So first of all, fiction. I read a lot of manga this month. I do have to add that I do read quite a bit of manga, and I feel like that sometimes pushes up these numbers that I talk about when I talk about reading 28 books in a month, because each volume of manga I count separately, so that does kind of contribute to these very high numbers. I read in 2 series that I am continuing in the month of November, and I also started a new series in the month of November. So I read volumes 25 and 26 for the series Komi Can't Communicate by Tomohito Oda. I did find that 25 was a weak point in the series, volume 25 that is, but 26 rebounded strong, so I have faith and hope in the continuation of this series. I also am reading the series Haikyuu, which is a sports manga by Haruichi Furudate, and I read volumes 37 through 40, so 4 volumes right there. In this series, the Karasuno boys high school volleyball team is continuing at the Tokyo Spring Tournament, and they are doing quite well, so I've been loving that series. I think I'm getting close to the end of that series, and I'm going to be sad to wrap that up, but also that means I can kind of start another longer series, so it's kind of a trade-off, and I've been really enjoying Haikyuu. The volume of a new series that I started, I don't know if started is the right word because I'm not sure if I'm going to continue it, is After the Rain. I do have a review scheduled for this book on December 5th, which will be coming out. So I'll talk more about my feelings there, about why I maybe am not going to continue this series. But if you have read this series, then stay tuned for the review to hear my thoughts on that. So those were all the manga series or volumes that I read in this month. Next, moving on to my Hugo challenges. So I'm trying to read through every Hugo Award winner and finalist just based on the Wikipedia pages for Best Novel and Best Novella for the Hugo Award. And I'm currently working through the 1956 finalists for Best Novel. So I think that kind of contributed to some of my above average reviews this month. Because I'm reading books that are necessarily winners or at least finalists, these are books that have been recognized as outstanding in their field and therefore maybe a cut above average. So I feel like I had a lot of great reads this month, and some of that's probably just from me reading a lot of these greats or books that were considered for a finalist or a prize position in 1956 at least. So for the Hugo Award reading challenge I set for myself, I read The End of Eternity, which is by Isaac Asimov. This is the first Asimov book that I have ever read, which is very surprising that I made it to the age that I am without reading an Asimov book, especially because I read quite a bit. I thought, but I'm pretty sure this is the first one. I don't think I've read another one by him, which is quite surprising. And I enjoyed it. I thought it was a great series. And surprisingly, the female characters were not written poorly for a book written from the 1950s, which is sometimes a problem that I have with those older books. So The End of Eternity, very good. Additionally, I read Not This August by C.M. Kornbluth. Well, I think that may have been more of a sci-fi a sci-fi book when it was written. It discussed the Cold War getting hot and the US losing. It's now more of an alternative history style book. That's kind of the genre I would put it in, just because this is now something that occurred in the 60s, so something that occurred in the past, so we're talking about an alternate timeline. That book was very good and very well written. I thought it was interesting to read, but I do think that the author was kind of relying on the fears that were present maybe in the 1950s regarding things like the Soviet Union. And without that current threat of like a Soviet Union or a Cold War getting hot, I should say, it does kind of lose a little bit in the translation. But we're reading books that are over 50, 60, 70 years old, so it makes sense that some of these are not going to age perfectly. The next one I read was by Leigh Brackett, an author that I have been reading and loving this month. I read The Long Tomorrow by her, which was a dystopian book set in the future in the United States. I loved it. I have the review of all of these, unless explicitly mentioned on my channel, but I loved The Long Tomorrow. I thought it was a great book. It really feels like a masterpiece, even though I haven't read everything by Leigh Brackett. It definitely feels like a very good, solid work by her, and I really recommend checking her out if you're looking for a new sci-fi fantasy author to read. Next, we're going to go into the final fiction that I read, and those were all in the sci-fi fantasy category, so I definitely leaned hard into both manga and sci-fi fantasy this month. I didn't read anything outside of those two genres, which those are probably my two top areas I read fiction in, so it kind of makes sense. It didn't surprise me, but it did surprise me that I didn't read anything outside of those genres, not that they were my top two genres. That's what I mean to say. So I read Finna and Defect. These were both by Nino Sebri, and these were in the Littenverse universe. This is about a big box store that's kind of in this liminal weird space where it's supposedly taking place in this universe, but not really, because there are things like wormholes opening up in the store and minimum wage employees are sent into these wormholes to find missing customers, things like that. The books are really well written. I think the author really has a talent for building worlds and making places really interesting, so I would definitely read anything else by this author, and I would suggest this author to anyone who's kind of looking to get started or want something a little lighter, not a 700-page sci-fi adventure, but more of a 130-page sci-fi adventure. Again, that's Finna and the Defect. Those are two books 1 and 2 in the Littenverse world, and I really enjoyed this series. So I'm glad that I found it. I actually read these in reverse order too. I read Defect first, and then I went back and read book 1, which was Finna, but that did not affect anything. You can get the whole story no matter which order you read those in, just as a word of warning. Next, I read 2 novellas by Leigh Brackett. So again, I'm kind of really liking Leigh Brackett's style right now. It's from the 50s, so there are some things with like her assuming there's life on Venus, which I don't know if that was a stylistic choice or if the lack of life on Venus had yet to be confirmed when she was writing these books, or these might have been even from before the 1950s. But I'm not sure what that is. However, I think the novellas were really interesting. We had Last Call from Sector 9G. That actually takes place like way out in space on distant systems. And then we also have The Moon That Vanished. That's the one that takes place on Venus. I liked both of them. And out of all of the novellas that I've read from Leigh Brackett, which in, I believe it was October, I read The Jewel of Boz. It was either September or October, I read The Jewel of Boz, and then I read Last Call from Sector 9G and The Moon That Vanished. I like The Moon That Vanished the best out of all of those. I don't really want to compare the novellas to The Long Tomorrow, which is a novel length, because I feel like comparing those two can definitely be, I don't know, it's hard to compare a novella to a novel and say which one you like better, because I feel like they're a little bit different of a writing style, but The Long Tomorrow is also good. So I don't want to compare those two, but The Moon That Vanished was very good. Each novella I read by Leigh Brackett, I feel like just gets better and better. So hopefully that trend continues, because I think there's a lot more novellas available through my library for me to read. So I will be reading those. Finally, I read The Crack in Space by Philip K. Dick. This book, there's also a review on my channel. I went back and forth on whether or not I even wanted to write a review on my channel. It's definitely very dated. There's a central theme that talks about racial relations in the United States, which definitely feels a little bit dated to a modern reader reading this book that was written in, I believe, the 1960s. But the overall concept is that there is this crack in the universe and it leads to another world, which is actually at the exact same time and place as the current world, but there was a different line of evolution that was taken, so a different type of human that isn't Homo sapiens evolved, if that makes sense. And I think the concept is really good, and I really like the characters that Philip K. Dick builds, and this is in all of his stories. I think the ending was maybe a little rushed and a little open-ended, and again, there's the whole part that feels very dated to a modern reader reading stuff from 1960, but overall, I think it's still decent. Yeah, it's one of those things that happens when you read books from the 50s and 60s. There are things that just feel dated. It's just something you have to kind of accept and realize that the world has evolved. And perhaps that's a good thing. Actually, that is a good thing. Now we're going to move into nonfiction. So everyone who did not want to listen to my fiction, welcome. We're in the nonfiction section. The nonfiction section, I pull from a wide variety of topics. I rarely stay on one topic in nonfiction. I feel like I want to get better at that, but I skip all around because everything in the world is interesting to me, so I read books on everything. First, I read Fighting Fibonacci by Keith Devlin. This is a book that recounts the author's search for information about Fibonacci, who introduced Hindu Arabic numbers into the Western world, into Western Europe, and this was a game changer for mathematics. He's also known for the Fibonacci sequence, this number sequence generation that has parallels in the natural world, we can say. The book was quite interesting overall. It mostly was focused almost on the travel aspect of the author Keith Devlin going around and following the footsteps of this mathematician because there's so little biographical information about this mathematician. So I want to make it clear, it's probably as close as you're going to get to a biography of Fibonacci, but I don't think it really is a biography of Fibonacci. It also seemed to tie in with another book the author had written, and I feel like you kind of needed to read both of them to get the full picture. But overall, it was a decent book, and it gave me a little bit more background about this mathematician. Next up, I read 2 books on a Japanese artist, which was Kyosai. Kyosai is a Japanese artist who's not as well known in the West, particularly when we compare him to other artists that maybe are more well known in the West, like Hakusai. So he's someone that I had not heard of. I found his name in another collection of works that I had out of Japanese art, and I was just really drawn in by his work, so I placed some holds to get books specifically on Kyosai. I have Kyosai, the Israel Goldman collection, that review is out, and Kyosai's Animal Circus. These are actually both written by Sadamura Koto, who I kind of got the sense is a leading expert on Kyosai. She wrote both those books, so I think she kind of knows what she's talking about. Both of them were interesting, fascinating books, and if you're interested in Japanese history but haven't done a deep dive, you may not be familiar with Kyosai, and I do recommend checking his works out, especially the Israel Goldman collection, the Kyosai Israel Goldman collection. That one I feel like was really good because it had a big fat pages for you to look at. Sometimes in art, when you have a small book, it can be hard to get all the details. So when you're looking at art, sometimes I like having those bigger books to look through. Next up, I read one of the top books this month, and that is the Book of Yokai by Michael Dylan Foster. This was just a collection of different yokai, or these supernatural spirits that exist in Japanese mythology and folklore, and this book kind of gave a broad overview of some of the common types. It was a very well put together book, the kind of book that I'm actually seeking a personal copy for. I do not own a lot of books. Well, I'm sitting in front of my bookshelf, but compared to a lot of people who read as much as I do not own a lot of books. I do not buy the books that I read unless I think I'm going to reference them repeatedly, or I get them as a gift, or as a book that I just really would like to own. That may change when I get a permanent house that I'm living in for maybe 40, 50, 60 years. Right now I'm renting, and I hate moving books. It is my least favorite part of the moving process is loading up boxes and boxes of books, because they seem to weigh 500 pounds when they're in boxes, no matter how small the boxes are. But I gave myself an exception for books that I'm going to reference frequently or that I really, really enjoy, and that includes the Book of Yokai by let's say this correctly, Michael Dylan Foster. So if you're looking to get started with the yokai and their role in Japanese mythology and folklore, this book is an excellent place to start, and it's one that you want to pick up a physical copy, not a library copy, which is how I read it, but I would recommend getting a physical copy if you think it's something you're going to reference again and again. Next up, we have Medieval Monsters by Sherry Lindquist. This book was a solid book overall. It was just missing that extra spark that makes a book pop. And I think for that reason, it was just okay. It was a 3-star read for sure. The information was there. They talked about mythology and the medieval mind and the way it played into different things in society, but it was just missing that extra something that makes a book come to life. For that reason, it was just an okay book. I do a review of that, of course, like all of these on my channel. Next, I read a kid's book on accident. I was kind of going to town on the library hold system on my library's website, and I just placed a hold on everything that looked like it might have something to do with medieval monsters, and that included Monsters by John Malum, which was a kid's book, which I'd still reviewed, but again, I'm not the target audience, so I feel like I can't really malign it or mention too much about it because I feel like I can't give an accurate review. I'm not the target audience, and I'm not an expert. I know there's adults out there who still review kids' books, and I am not one of those. So I reviewed it, but I'm not the target audience, nor do I feel qualified to review kids' books. So I can't malign it too much. Next, I read Printed and Painted, The Meiji Art of Ogata Gekko by Amy Newland. This is another collection of Japanese art by the artist Ogata Gekko. This was very enjoyable. It also featured art from other contemporary Japanese artists or relevant pieces that tied in with Ogata Gekko's work. So this was another enjoyable volume. It's an art volume. It's quite big, or bigger than like a regular book like this, or that's not a good size. Bigger than a regular book like this. So it's good for viewing art. I just feel like I like those bigger styles for viewing art more. That was a perfectly enjoyable read. Next up was a small little photography collection. This was Ice Caves of Leelanau by Ken Scott. He is a photographer who photographs in the northern United States, and I really enjoy his work. This was a small volume, definitely a hidden gem, but the photography was excellent. It's winter photography, so if that sounds interesting to you, I do have the review of that on my channel as well, and you can check that out. Next, I read a collection of essays all on the Georgian Bay. Georgian Bay is a part of Lake Huron, although the authors of this collection do treat it as a separate Great Lake as part of the Great Lakes that are in the United States and Canada. Although Georgian Bay is primarily in the Canadian section, I actually was able to take a camping trip there this last fall, and I really enjoyed it, and I love the landscape and the features. I wanted to learn more about it. I got this book, and boy did I learn more about it. Review of that is also on my channel, and I highly recommend visiting Georgian Bay if you have the opportunity to visit, depending on where you are currently living in the world. And the next is an audiobook I listened to. This one, the review is coming. I don't have it scheduled yet, but it is coming. It's coming. And that is Flawless, a fascinating look at K-beauty. This was, or that's not the subtitle, but it is a fascinating look at K-beauty. So K-beauty definitely has influence in the world today, and this was an audiobook written by Elise Hu, which kind of looked at the role that this beauty plays, but then also the beauty industry at large and the pressure it exerts on women. This was an excellent, excellent, excellent audiobook. I almost wish I had the physical book as well of this one, but I don't know if I want to move it. But it's definitely worth checking out of your library, getting a physical copy if you don't mind buying physical books and then moving them all over from apartment to apartment. Be my guest. Flawless, highly recommend. Finally, I have a book that I did not review and I'm not going to review on my channel because it kind of falls into like the personal development. And normally I do not talk about these books during my reading wrap-ups or in general because I feel like what personal self-help book works for people is so personal, and the book that changed your life might just sound ridiculous to me, and the book that revolutionized my time management is a book that just doesn't work for you. Like, there's no sense in talking about it and getting in fights with people. What works for you works for you. But this one, and also I have to add, this book also kind of falls into like a business help book, which I am immediately suspicious of. Like any book that's like, get more sales in a year, I don't know why, but they always give me red flags, and I'm like, maybe I won't read that one. But this one, I heard someone talking about it when they were discussing how they set up a planner, and I was like, I'm pretty sure this guy wrote a book about a system that I independently invented by myself. So I gave it a read, and sure enough, that was what happened. The book is The 12-Week Year. The concept of this book is that instead of setting year-long goals, you set goals for 12-week chunks. And then you execute on the 12-week chunks and you kind of set goals for yourself and you grade yourself weekly on the goals. The idea is by shortening the time frame, you get more done and you're more focused, which I completely agree, because without ever reading or knowing this book existed, I independently invented this. I just call it setting goals by seasons. I set my goals that I'm working on by season. So we just moved into the winter season. So I set my goals for the winter. There's no sense in setting a goal or working on a goal that's labeled work on open water swimming when I live in the north and I'm not going to be doing open water swimming anytime in the next 6 months. So I do have overall yearly things that might be nice to do, kind of more like a yearly bucket list, but then I look at 12 months or 12 weeks at a time, or in my case, just the season. So December, January, February, the winter season. What do I want to do this winter? What do I want to accomplish this winter? And I set my goals up like that. Somehow, someone else thought of this and wrote a whole book on it, which tells me that I should have written a whole book on it and sold it and made a lot of money. But there you go, 12-week year, it works for me. I don't think you have to follow his plan exactly, but I do think there is benefit in breaking up your yearly goals into shorter chunks. But what works for me doesn't work for you, and what works for you doesn't work for me, so I don't want to start getting up here and proselytizing about what self-help business book works. But that book was actually quite enjoyable, quite good, and I feel like it explained a system that I wasn't inherently suspicious of because it was one that I had already invented, if that makes sense. I just had come up with it independently. Kind of like the whole calculus thing, right? Leibniz and Newton independently invented it. I independently invented the 12-week year. I am just not profiting off the book sales, unfortunately. Now let's talk about my DNF. I DNF'd The City Authentic, How the Attention Economy Builds Urban America. I got this book out and the title was so intriguing and I was so interested and ready to read it, and I just couldn't get into it. I was 20 pages in and I was just feeling beyond blech. There was no spark, nothing that interested me. I feel like the author started with a very combative tone and I was just immediately turned off, which was a huge disappointment because when I looked at reviews online to see if anyone else kind of felt the same way that I did, people seemed to enjoy the premise of his book. And I think also maybe I wouldn't have agreed with everything this author was going to put out or solutions to economic problems or societal problems the author was going to put out. I was intrigued to know the author's position, so I was disappointed when I couldn't even get into the book. And this so rarely happens to me because especially with nonfiction, because I'm so curious about everything that it's rare for me to find a nonfiction book that so completely does not resonate with me that I can't even finish it. Most of the time I can glean something from a book and I can keep reading it. This one I just couldn't finish it. I was like 20 pages in and it wasn't even that long of a book, and I knew it was going to be a slog the whole way through and I probably wasn't going to enjoy it, so I decided to just give up on it and let it go. I feel like sometimes authors write books for people who are looking to know, and other authors write books for people who are in the know. And The City Authentic felt like a book that was for people in the know, people who already had the starting assumptions the author had, people who already had the background the author had, and people who already were going to agree with some of the basic premises the author was working from. When I went into this book, I wanted to know. I was in the looking to know camp. I was like, what do you see the problems are with this attention economy in urban America? What is your proposal? What are your starting assumptions? How did you reach these conclusions given the data? And going from there, what policies would you like to implement, or what are some observations that you have? I wanted to hear the author's perspective. The author seemed to just wanted to gather people who already agreed with his starting position, his starting assumptions, and just talk about his opinions, but without giving me that key information that I feel like I, as a reader who was looking to know instead of in the know, needed to read the book. So rarely happens, but I did choose to DNF The City Authentic. Now, sometimes you may notice that when I have books for my book haul that I don't review, they might not be listed as a DNF, and that's because sometimes I don't get to them in time, or people from the library will place a hold on the book. And when that happens, and I'm like, I'm gonna have to renew it to read it, I normally just return it because I don't want to inconvenience someone else who probably has less books out than me. Like, I can read something else in the meanwhile with someone else maybe needing this book for a class or some reason. So I just return books and then they go on my TBR list or my to be read list. This one was a true DNF. I'm not going to read it. Excuse me. So that's what happens to most of my nonfiction books that you don't see reviewed. This one is truly gone. This one is not going to be read. Let's talk about the best ones that I read this month. Probably The Long Tomorrow by Leigh Brackett. It was just so good. Of course, I do have to say The Moon That Vanished was also really good as a novella. Leigh Brackett just kind of stole the show. I also want to give out a shout out to the manga series Haikyuu. When writing such a long series, I'm already on volume 40, or I'll be reading volume 41. I feel like it's really easy to have weak volumes or volumes that don't resonate as well, as we saw with Komi Can't Communicate. But Haruichi Furudate has just kept the excellent quality up throughout the entire series, and I just have to give him props for that. Like, that is a really hard thing to do, I think, when writing such a long series, and it's just been continued excellence from the beginning. Of course, there are some volumes I think that are more emotionally hard-hitting than others, but I feel like the pacing is good, the story is good, the whole thing's good. I can't fault it in any way, and I've just really been enjoying it. So yeah, I wanted to give props to Haikyuu, even though I read volumes 37 through 40, which is kind of an awkward mix for this month. They've just been excellent all the way through, and the author has done an excellent job, so shout out because there's credit and I want to give credit where credit is due. Not so great, or no. Nonfiction, I wanted to give a shout out to Flawless too. Flawless, the audiobook, the review of that is coming. That one was also excellent, but I don't want to get too far into it because I still want to post my review on that audiobook. That was Flawless by Elise Hu. The Blah ones, After the Rain, Volume 1, review for that scheduled December 5th. I had some problems with that one. You can listen to the review. I don't want to talk about the review before it posts, but that wasn't really my favorite. And I was disappointed because the art and some of the aspects of the story were so good. You'll have to listen to the review and let me know if you think I should continue reading the series. Monsters by John Malum. I didn't really want to put it in like the Black category. I'm just not the target audience. I checked out a kid's book on accident and it was fine. I feel like there are better kids' books on monsters though. And finally, Medieval Monsters by Sherry Lindquist. It was just missing that spark that makes a book pop, and I wanted to enjoy it, but it was just a 3-star read. It just gave information, nothing stuck out to me, and I think it's just going to kind of be one of those books where I absorb some knowledge and then it floats away back into my memory. That being said, I do tend to remember almost every book I read. If I need to look at the cover, so I need something to trigger the memory, but if I see the cover of the book I read, I can usually remember almost everything about it. But the better the book is, the more I can remember about it, and the worse the book is, or not even worse, sometimes if the book is really bad, I can remember a lot about that. I did not enjoy the Agatha Raisin books, and I can remember quite a bit of the detail about the Agatha Raisin books, even now. Those were like a cozy mystery series that I was reading. A book that's missing the spark, I'm almost going to completely forget. And I think this is one of those books that I'm going to almost completely forget. The knowledge is going to be sucked in and taken with all the other knowledge, and then the whole book is going to be completely forgotten because it was just missing that spark. So, and of course, The City Authentic, but I've already given a whole section of time devoted to that one. Please let me know what you read in November and how you are doing. I hit my overall yearly reading goal at 250 books this month, so I'm very excited to have met that goal. I want to know how you're doing for the year, if you plan on meeting your goals, or if maybe your goal needs a little bit of adjustment, what books you read and what books you loved for the month of November. I love to hear it, get suggestions, get ideas on what I should read next, and I hope that you stick around for the rest of my book reviews. Otherwise, I hope you have a great rest of your day.